Today, we'll be putting our range function to work by including it in a loop. By doing this, we can more easily create a loop that would have used a count variable. But to do this, we need to move beyond a while loop and look at something called a for loop. Today, we'll define and code for loops and learn when to use a for loop instead of a while loop. To recap, anytime we wanted to execute a set of code an exact number of times, we would use a while loop with a count variable. Something like this, where we have to manually initialize and update a count variable and create our own control expression for the loop. The more things we need to remember to do in our code, the greater the chance of an error. And since this kind of loop is so common in programming, there's another type of loop, the for loop. That's designed to help make this a lot easier. This is the equivalent of the while loop we just saw, but as a for loop. You see, there's no count variable per se, and therefore nothing to update and no control variable either. Besides what lines we are executing in the loop, the for loop works all in just a single line. So let's break down the syntax of this for loop and what's happening here. Remember, the range function creates a sequence of numbers, and in this case, it creates 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4, 5 numbers. The I in the header of the for loop is a variable. This sort of works like our count variable and is necessary for a for loop to work. It's pretty standard to use I as our variable name. I stands for iteration, which is what we call one repetition of a loop. You could, however, use any variable name, x, num, count, whatever. So when we do for I in range of 5, don't forget that colon. Each time through the loop, a number that the range function created will be stored to I. And since there are 5 numbers, the loop will run 5 times. And that's it. Let's go ahead and put this in our program so we can play around with a few things. So here is that same code. And when we run it, sure enough, hello is output 5 times. So what if I were to change the I to be range 10 instead? It outputs hello 10 times. The reason is because that range method creates 10 numbers. And if I wanted it to print 1,000 times, I just change this to 1,000. And it's as easy as that. Now let's replace the word hello with the variable I and change the range back to 5. What do you think will happen now? You might think that it prints 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. But remember, what is happening each time the loop runs? Each time the loop runs, the values that are created by the range function are being stored to I. So when we run this, the first time that the for loop runs, the first value from the range function is saved into I. So it prints 0, then 1, then 2, 3, and 4. So not only will a for loop run for an exact number of times, but it can also leverage the fact that those values from the range function are stored to I each time the loop iterates. So what do you think would happen now if I change range 5 to range 1, 10? We run this and see that it prints 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9 times. The loop ran 9 times, each time outputting I, which contains the numbers that were generated by the range function. What if I wanted to print out 1 through 10 instead? We just change this 10 to an 11, and there we go. And if I wanted to go from 5 through 10, I would change to range 5, 11, and run this. Now we print 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. So the while loop was able to run an exact number of times. But now we have the for loop, which can do the same thing. However, a for loop is a lot easier to use, just like we saw above. So why don't we use a for loop for everything? Why do we have while loops at all? Well, a for loop is used only for when we want to execute code an exact number of times. But to do that, it uses the range function, not user input. A for loop cannot replace the power of a while loop when we need user input to control the loop and when it runs an indefinite amount of times. So the general rule is, if a loop runs an exact number of times, use a for loop. Or else, when we don't know how many times it runs, user input controlled, we use a while loop. Alright, let's end this with you trying one. Create a for loop that will output 1 through 3, but all on the same line. Like 1, 2, 3. Pause the video and resume once you're ready. So we start with for I in range, and then we want to start the loop at 1 and go to 3. So we need 1, 4. Then we want to print I inside the loop. So we have print I. But the twist here is that they need to be on the same line. So to do that, we add another parameter in our print. So we do comma, then end equals space in quotes. Now we run this and we see 1, 2, 3. Perfect. Okay, let's actually do one more. Print the word Python 3 times using the for loop, again, keeping it on the same line. Pause and resume when you're ready. This one is also pretty easy. And again, since this runs an exact number of times, no user input controlling the loop, we leverage the power and ease of the for loop. We do for I in range 3, remember the colon afterwards, and then do print Python, comma, end equals space in quotes. And just like that, we have a loop that runs 3 times. So you'll notice that sometimes we used I in the loop and sometimes we didn't. That's another powerful part of for loops. If I just want something to repeat X amount of times, we don't have to use I in the loop. However, we can. For example, maybe I want to output day 1 something, day 2 something, and day 3 something. In order for each output to use 1, 2, and 3, we can use the I. Not only would this loop run 3 times, but it also would use I to help output it slightly differently each time. The code to do that would look like this. Here, we loop exactly 3 times. And that's because range creates 3 numbers, 1, 2, and 3. And we also utilize those numbers by using I in our output. Today, we learned about the for loop. The for loop is a replacement for a while loop that uses a control variable. In combination with the range function, the for loop can do many things. We'll continue to learn more about unique ways we can use the for loop, so stay tuned.